Well, Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan says South Africa's chronic unemployment problem is likely to get worse. Gordhan has warned that investor confidence will deteriorate if the country does not sort out the current labour unrest. He says if labour relations challenges are not resolved, the country's confidence will deteriorate and there will be job losses and business failures. So joining us now for more on this, Tony Healy, labour analyst from Tony Healy and Associates. Tony, thank you so much for joining us. So, of course, when we see comments coming through like this from the finance minister, certainly sending out a warning signal. We know that even Jill Marcus continues to make comments, that the governor of the Reserve Bank continues to make comments around this, the negative spiral that, violence, high demands, job losses could continue to lead to. What's your assessment as to what we're seeing playing out right now?
I think there has to be grave concerns around the vast number of wildcat strikes we're seeing regarding the excessive demands that we're seeing coming through from labour. And as we go into the wage negotiation season, there has to be great concern around that, particularly in the context of growing and increasing job losses and the pressure on, for example, employers in general to meet goals and objectives in terms of profitability.
Yeah, let's just quickly focus on that, issue of are these demands reasonable or unreasonable from labour unions? Because in the auto sector, 20% is what they're demanding there. Around 35,000 people are employed by the sector, even though South Africa only produces 1% of cars globally. 35,000 people is a lot, but they want 20%. I mean, is this unreasonable? I mean, what's the response that is likely to come from the auto sector relative to where wages are right now?
Well, the question of reasonability depends on who you ask. If you ask the average rank and file union member, they would say that it's reasonable because their particular inflation is higher than, for example, the CPI. Turning to employers, on the other hand, they will say, well, hang on a second, there are so many pressures on costs that we simply can't meet those kinds of demands. But I think what we're seeing is unions flexing their muscles and seeking to re-establish their credibility, particularly the COSATU unions, who have lost a lot of credibility in the last 12 months. I would, in my opinion, not only just to intimidation, but to a general disenchantment with the way in which they've been, in the eyes of many union members, ignoring the grassroots issues that rank and file union members are faced with.
I mean, that is an issue. Living conditions, the cost of living for people earning very low salaries as it is.
Sure.
If you continue to see people, rise up against very kind of menial salaries and I suppose the higher cost of livings, at some point in time someone has to intervene because you see Labour speaking out in a very vocal and visible way.
Yes, and I think it's perhaps these are more than just simple labour issues. They go beyond that. There are concerns around, I think, perceptions that there hasn't been political enfranchisement.
There has been political enfranchisement.
I beg your pardon. Economic enfranchisement. My apologies. Economic enfranchisement has not kept pace with political enfranchisement, and those are concerns. And those frustrations then often are acted out in the workplace together with other more day-to-day labour disputes and demands.
But what do you see as the tactics that are working for Labour right now? Because it's more and more unprotected strikes, wildcat strikes, as opposed to protected strikes. I mean, do you think that this cycle is going to continue where the wildcat strikes happen and then ultimately companies give in to demands because they want to resume production to some level of normality? Yes,
and I think therein lies the dilemma. If we look in the last 12 months, this wildcat unprotected strike action has achieved many things for Labour, when in fact it ought not to have because it's unlawful. But looking back over the last 12 months, Labour say, you know what, when we down tool spontaneously in a wildcat fashion, we've achieved certain of our objectives. So that has kind of strengthened and emboldened them and inclined them more often to resort to wildcat strike action than really they ought to have.
But that being said, I mean, what does it mean about any agreements that are even reached this time around? I mean, will they have any credibility?
Well, there has to be concern around that. We saw it in Marikana last year and others where collective agreements were signed and midway through the term of those agreements, Labour downs tools and they say, well, regardless of whether they're signed or not, we're not going to abide by them. And as you rightly said, then employers are placed under pressure. They want to resume production, so they very often have capitulated in response to that. But they can't do so indefinitely, and sooner or later Labour, I think, has to understand that there are rules of the game that have to be complied with.
Yeah. I mean, what type of conversations are you having with your clients right now around how they should be responding to the wildcat, unpredictable strikes that we see popping up in all the sectors in South Africa?
Yes. There's undeniably an increasing inclination on the part of employers to say enough is enough, and to consider, perhaps more quickly than they have in the past, the possibility even of dismissal in the case of wildcat industrial action, because they can't continue to be exposed to the risks that flow from that.
But I mean, you know, can they do that in the face of government that we've got an upcoming election year, an employment rate above 25%, and a government very worried about, the fact that there's not creating jobs? I mean, there's a lot of pressure politically, is what I'm trying to say, to not cut jobs. Do companies have a choice?
Yes, well, I think we've seen it with the AMPLATs. We've seen government involvement in terms of the original retrenchment numbers suggested, because there are social consequences to retrenchments, and I think that's a very important factor, and it's a tricky balancing act that employers are going to have to deal with. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the cold reality of their profitability and even their survival, and on the other hand, the pressures of government to be aware of the social consequences of retrenchments, for example.
Well, the market in South Africa is just closed, so just making mention of that, and just looking at the markets here, up 1.7%, the all-share index, 41,770 points. It certainly has been a day where it's powered ahead, but Growth Point today down 4.4% after announcing that equity raising, and Richemont is a stock that is the soared to above 90 Rand. We'll get into that after this break, but just one last question for you, Tony. Mike McFarlane is one of the heads now at Anglo Gold Ashanti, and the reason I'm bringing up this is because he's very much involved in looking at new technology in the mining sector, and there's a big focus for mining companies right now looking at how to reduce reliance on workers, on kind of volatile workers, if you're talking about it from that perspective. Is that what some of your clients are looking at, ways to get around employing people who are going to be unpredictable, just to put it very simply?
Mechanisation has been a strategy that many employers have adopted for many years. The mining industry has been slow to respond because I think of the social consequences of large-scale retrenchments. But if we compare ourselves to our colleagues in Australia, mechanised mining is very advanced, and it's certainly locally, many mining organisations are looking at increasing mechanisation for that very reason, to overcome the challenges that are faced with a largely labour-intensive work.